Hello, everyone. Welcome to another this virtual discussion related to climate change. And this time we would like really to discuss the importance and usefulness of macro modeling in helping policymaking making better choices on how they can cope with climate change challenges. We have been having these conversations since last week. In Glasgow, as well as here in Washington, and we are reaching out across the world. And this time, we are really privileged to have our friend Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the finance minister of Indonesia, join us. Thank you very much, Sri Mulyani, for joining us. And from the World Bank side, it is Indermit Gill, our Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions, who will talk a little bit more about what the World Bank doing. So in order to set the stage and then turn to Sri Mulyani, I will turn first to Indermit to explain briefly what the role of the macro models is doing, and particularly the link with climate change and how you are further developing these models. Over to you, Indermit.
Thank you, Axel, for inviting me to take part in this discussion. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Sri Mulyani. So you had asked me to summarize a little bit about what macro models are and how they can help us inform climate policies in developing countries. I guess the best way to introduce them is that macro models provide a very simplified picture of the economy of a country, a region, or the world. And by that, I mean a representation of a set of economic relationships. So, for example, between gross national product, between employment, and between investment, and so on. Now, simplified means compared with reality, right? But simplified doesn't always mean simple. Some macro models actually have hundreds of variables, right? So as you can imagine, simple models are easier to build and maintain, but they're less accurate and less granular, right? More complicated models might provide more granularity and more accuracy, but they're less transparent in that it's not always, I guess it's not always easy to understand what variable is leading to what effects and so on, right? So for example, it's not always easy to understand, say, how the price of carbon leads to higher output in one part of the services sector and less in another, right? So more granular models are also expensive to maintain. So in modeling, as in real life, there are trade-offs. But there are ways to manage these trade-offs, Axel. One way is not to just rely on a big supermodel to answer every question. So it's much better to have three mini models that are simpler, that complement each other, rather than one big supermodel. So in macroeconomics, unlike real life, supermodels are not always beautiful, right? The other thing to note is that the accuracy of the model fades as we look further and further into the future, since we can't easily model things like changes in technology and recessions and world oil prices 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And the way to manage this is to use these models for choosing between different policy measures today, rather than relying on them too much to decide whether to do something today or 10 years later or 25 years later and so on. So like people, models can answer questions about things that they know better, right? Uh, these models have been around for a couple of decades, but they have improved a lot, especially, I guess, especially over the last few years or so. They owe their origins to experts like Professor William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for exactly these kind of things. And they were first created to actually estimate the effects of energy use and emissions on the economy. Now, they were later extended to include climate change. And at their core still is this interaction between economics, energy, and the climate, right? Now, these models generally did four things quite well. They generate consistent projections. So, for example, what happens to projected GDP as, what happens to emissions as well as projected GDP, and to make sure that they're consistent with each other. The second is that they calculate the impact of different assumptions on things like output, emissions, and the temperature, and so on. The third thing that they do is that they trace the effects of mitigation and adaptation policies and estimate the costs and benefits. And the last one is they can also estimate the uncertainty associated with alternative climate strategies, as well as new technologies. Now, at the World Bank, we've been using these models for about 10 years now, and we have a suite of models, right? But essentially, they do two things. They help us quantify the impact of three variables: gradual global warming, extreme weather events, and mitigation and adaptation policies. And we look to see how these three things affect four types of outcomes. The first one is macro aggregates like GDP and national employment. The second one is sectoral magnitudes like energy consumption and farm output and things like that. The third one are the core benefits of climate action like lower death rates due to less pollution. And the last one is distributional consequences of climate policies like poverty rates and so on. I can give you examples of this if you like, but for now, back to you.
Well, thank you very much. This sets really the stage, and these are a lot of questions. And so I would like to turn to Sri Mulyani, because as a policymaker, models are wonderful, but ultimately, as a finance minister, you think, well, what does that mean for my budget? What does it mean ultimately also on distributional of expenditures, like the impact of climate on poverty, or in your case, on some of the islands? So I was just wondering, when you are now being confronted with, apart from the unquote normal standard macro fiscal issues, you have now an added level of complexity to it, namely on the climate change. And what is even worse for you as finance minister, it costs loads of money. So that is so how do you see actually these models that will not give you the ultimate truth, but may help you also clarify the policy formulation? So my question there is, how do you put that in the context of Indonesia, and particularly the specific challenges you are right now facing, and for which you actually need better answers?
Well, thank you, Axel, and also Indermit, for explaining about how macro modeling can actually provide insight, but also forecast of a certain policy or shock within the economy. I think for me, as well as within the policy making process in Indonesia, first, we usually also believe that if you provide evidence, it will be much easier to then manage the political process, because the evidence base is going to facilitate the debate or the discussion based on certain evidence. So that is something which usually, rather than everybody can talk normative, so you cannot, especially when you are talking about finance, public finance, budget, in which you are going to make a decision how much you are going to allocate for what is going to be the trade-off. These are all the decision process or decision that require an evidence. Of course, there is a political process. So evidence then, when you are talking about the economic reality, Indermit mentioned earlier about reality versus the model. In reality, you can always pick a certain statistic or data and then present it without context, without causality, without complexity of how this is going to be. So you can also using the evidence not to lead but mislead in this case, right? So I think macroeconomic modeling can provide a certain credibility of at least the effort to replicate the reality and complexity of a certain change or policy or regulation, right, will actually affect whatever the goals that the government is going to achieve. You mentioned about the economic growth, inflation, employment, or distribution like poverty, inequality, or even a certain sectoral. So even in a very, very, without putting the complexity of climate change or carbon with this, even if we are dealing with just the normal, regular economic situation, you've already have quite a complex issue that need to deal with, yeah, in this case. So when, for example, we are talking about this pandemic, COVID-19, how much it costs us, how we are going to design the fiscal policy in order to address this issue, whether we are going to allocate more, for example, for social safety net, or you are going to put more to protect the company or corporation. Or are you going to widen your deficit? Is it going to be good for the counter-cyclical, or this is going to backfire in the medium long term? I think these are a very real question that you cannot just like pointing to your button and then say, okay, yes, no, but you really need a tools to construct this policy. Then you are going to be able to present it on the political process to the politician in this case. And in this case, then you are going to be able to persuade, or in this case, to get the support of a certain policy, especially when the policy is so very, very, very sensitive. Now, you put this within the context of climate change, it's going to be even more. Because when you talk about climate change, I'm not talking about the consequence in which we are talking about warming of this world and that creating many of what you call it natural disaster driven by this climate change. And Indonesia as the big island country, this definitely real for us. But even when you're talking about, okay, if you know that consequences, if we cannot prevent those calamities because of climate change, how we are going to prevent that to happen? Then we are talking about, okay, Indonesia have to also support this reducing the increasing temperature, reducing the CO2. Then you translate it into identifying, for example, forestry sector, energy sector, transportation, waste, industries. Each of them, not only in this case I mentioned in the Glasgow meeting, have the price tag, but there is also a consequence of each of this policy. You cannot, in the macro modeling, I think what you're talking about, if you are having like static equilibrium to another static equilibrium, as if the change one equilibrium in another equilibrium, there is no consequences politically, socially, environmentally, then you are wrong. Model can provide us intuitive result, but you cannot precisely saying that when you reallocate resources from one to another, there is a huge consequences. Now, that's why I think for us, policymaker facing with this complexity, macroeconomic modeling definitely provide us with a tools to at least structuring our thinking, structuring our policy, structuring the issue, and then we are going to be able to then presenting the choices and the consequence, although not 100 precise, but at least intuitively you can provide this as an evidence. Then it will help politicians to then make up their mind. Okay, how much I'm going to pay, so the cost, and then who's within my constituent, the voter, is going to be affected by that. I will give you a very, very explicit example like in Indonesia. When you talk about the forestry and you're talking about stopping the deforestation, or we are going to have to reforestate the land which is deforested, what does it mean for the policy design? Who's going to benefit? Who's actually the player who created this deforestation? The benefit of this is going to offset the cost in terms of not only micro cost in this case, but also sectoral, macro, as well as global cost. That kind of thing will definitely very important. I talk about energy transition. We have a lot of coal in Indonesia. So if we talk about non-renewable to become renewable, it is not like switching on and off like electricity. This is going to have a huge, first from the money point of view, how much you are going to compensate the contract which is already there for the coal, which is already in a pipeline. How much you are going to get for building renewable, with a much bigger capacity. This is only like two status equilibrium, but then you are talking about within this coal, you know the location, you know the people who live from that, and how you are going to compensate the social economic dimension. Then you're talking nationally, will this going to create a better growth? Because then you put a shock, for example, like if Europe is going to impose, tariff of any manufacturing product produced in the country in which the
The border
electricity is
adjustment
not
price.
renewable, exactly, then you actually offsetting it. So there is an exogenous factor outside your own economic model, which can tilt or change the benefit. So this kind of thing, if you put everything, it seems like so complex, then you can be totally lost in translation. So for us, having this model is going to help us to, of course, as I said, structuring it, putting from block to another block so that you can actually provide more logical sequencing. Then you are going to be able to have a much better and clear policy discussion with the politician, the real policy maker.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is
that's more or less what I see.
This is one, thank you. And I think you pointed out a couple of areas. First, I think the evidence base is very important. I think also on the credibility, and that's my question to you, Indermit. It is what Srimaya, there are all these interlinkages. So you can do on the forestry, but you need to think of distributional effect, poverty effect, but also other effects on the wider economy. Yet you also said in your intro, and I think that's very powerful, you don't want to make it so complicated that actually you can't say anything anymore. So there is this balancing act, if you wish. How do you keep simplicity? In your intro, you said something, you may not want to have a such complex model that actually you can't say anything anymore. But then you need to be very clear in your communication that you are only investigating. And I think that is what Srimulani called the certain change in a model that you want to capture. And you may need to have another model that does it, but ultimately you need to pull this all together. Can you just comment also on how we want to approach it? Because you don't want to be naively simplistic, but at the same time, you also don't want to be desperately complicated that nothing is understood. So here, the models have to be the bridge builder.
Absolutely right, Axel. So I think the best way to answer your question maybe to give you two examples. So I can give you an example of a global model and then a quick example of a country-specific model. So the global example, I think that a really good example of this is the model that's called DICE, which we don't use at the World Bank, but which has been developed by Professor Nordhaus. And he uses that to shed light on questions such as what will happen to global emissions between now and 2030, 2040, and so on, if no policy action is taken. The second one is what would happen to carbon prices? What would have to happen to carbon prices between now and 2030 if we want to restrict the rise of average temperatures to say less than 2.5 degrees? Now, basically, you find that what this model says is that carbon prices would have to be hiked up a lot really quickly, and they would have to be hiked up to about $500, right? The second thing is then they also try to answer what levels of carbon prices would actually maximize the economic welfare of the world's people, not the climate temperature and so on, but the world's people over the next decade or 2 decades and so on. And in their estimation, in this case, carbon prices would have to rise gradually, but only up to about $100, right? So this is, I mean, specific examples of how you can use a global model to try to sort of say how one trades off economic output, how one trades off global temperature rises and so on. Now, if you want details of this, Axel, there's a very readable paper by Nordhaus called Integrated Assessment Models of Climate Change. And I can provide the links to that. The second example.
We'll put the link after this session so people can
absolutely, sir.
Download.
Absolutely. The second example is from an application of one of our models. It's called the MF mod. It's a workhorse macro fiscal model, and we applied it to Pakistan. And we can use this very country-specific model to answer questions that are on top of the minds of Pakistani policymakers, the Pakistani finance minister, and so on, right? So Pakistan faces different problems from those in Indonesia, right? They face three big economic problems due to climate change. One is the increased variability of rainfall and floods and droughts. And then they also face falling farm outputs due to rising temperatures and a decrease in worker productivity due to global warming, right? And it can take two types of actions. The first is mitigation policies like higher fuel prices that will reduce global emissions, but it'll do that just a little because Pakistan's contribution to global CO2 emissions is less than 0.5% of the total, right? But it could provide big local benefits like cleaner air for its citizens, right? The second, of course, is adaptation policies like building reservoirs and things like that. We can actually, using the model, we can estimate the effects of such policies like the removal of fuel subsidies and investment in irrigation in Pakistan. And we can look at that and see how does this affect per capita incomes, public expenditures, tax revenues, agricultural productivity, deaths due to pollution, rural and urban poverty rates, and so on. Now, Pakistan has decided to reduce GHG emissions by 20% over the normal thing. Now, these macroeconomics can actually, these models can tell you what are the best ways to actually do this. Should this be through greater investment in a more efficient electricity grid, or through a decrease in fuel subsidies and so on? And the model can also actually inform how to best implement Pakistan national the disaster risk. So now, if you want more details of this, Axel, there's an excellent paper by our colleague Andrew Burns and his co-authors, and it's called Climate Modeling for Macro Policy Effects. But we have all kinds of models, like both the global models as well as country models, as well as models that specifically try to look at the effects of carbon prices, right?
So I think that is helpful, but let me turn back to Sri Mulyani, who has to think of the next year's budget and an assault on of all sorts of demands, and usually it is more money. I don't think that you have ever come across a minister coming to you and saying, "Let me hand some money back so that you have some more options." I don't think that has ever happened. So one of the things is also with the modeling, you have here the business as usual. And you see that, unfortunately, things are maybe not improving, particularly as it regards to climate change, yet you have to have short-term decisions. So I can look at net zero at 2050, and that is wonderful, and it is necessary. At the same time, you are the one who needs to make the first step, if you wish, and you need to take the political heat. So, so it's not an ambiguous situation. So I think here is maybe where we, when organizations like the bank, but also a research institute, can actually need to be also helping you more sharply identify the short-term trade-offs that you ultimately will have to make, because in 2050 we can all talk and say what the world should do, but you are under the immediate pressure. So this is what I want to lay as maybe the last question for you as a reflection, and particularly also from Glasgow. And you said that at the finance ministers meeting very clearly, that you can talk about big money and you love it, but you need now, and you call that the real money, because that is the real budget you have to present now, next year, and the next 5 years, where the first critical step for climate change is. So that is what I wanted to, some still reflection on that, and also maybe the type of questions we could actually help you and other policymakers make that to make those trade-off decisions more clear and sharply put in focus how they can be paid for.
Well, I think in this case, this is the most challenging for us as a finance minister. At least for Indonesia, we have medium-term budget fiscal framework. So that need to be constructed. And of course, climate change is not the only issue that need to be addressed. So Axel, when you said about trade-off, There is always like other which is very much more eminent. For example, like this COVID, how much you are going to pay for the vaccine, how much you are going to pay for testing, tracing, all those things is so eminent and have to be paid now. And you look at your budget, you have your envelope, you have maximum envelope there, you are going to allocate. The question, of course, you cannot be just like go randomly every year. So there should be a certain like medium term orientation. So if you talk about net zero by 2050 or 2060, that means you are going to have medium term, usually 5 years, you are going to have like 6 times medium term. Now you are going to talk about how you are going to get the intuitive direction, given the aspiration in this case, then you are going to have the intuitive direction. What is the direction of the policy that you are aiming? For example, how big is your deficit will be allowed, but the deficit is a result or is a policy choice, because it could be like you have a growth, better revenue collection, discipline in spending, then you have a much better deficit, or in this case fiscal sustainability. But this is definitely important for Indonesia, because Indonesia, we do have what we call it fiscal prudential policy rule, which we are allowed to have. We only allowed to have deficit less than 3% of GDP. So that's become a different policy setting than, for example, other country. For example, like I talked to Minister of Finance Malaysia, they don't have those kind of fiscal rule. So for them, fiscal is consequence, deficit. For me, there is a legal constraint that I need to oblige. Now, then you are talking about what is the most important factor in this case. When we see the shock like pandemic, in which the poverty increase, unemployment increase, growth decline, then that is immediate on a policy as well, a policy maker as well as politician. I want to see this to be reversed. So that is going to be like immediate, and that's why that is going to be like the most important topic, how you are going to design the budget. Now, the most difficult for the climate change, and that's why what I'm saying, the consequence will be gradual but certain. But the policy choice, sometimes policymakers think that you can delay it. And the temptation is so big, especially when you have more immediate priority, right? So this is going to be one of the most difficult. Just talking about what you call it, real money and real political process. Politicians, especially on a democratic system, they are driven by election cycle. The election cycle can be 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. There is no election cycle of 20 years or 30 years. And that's why they are going to be very myopic. This is going to be the most important. Now, the modeling can at least provide us with the perspective and aspiration. And this is going to be also very powerful. For example, like in Indonesia, last night, actually, Axel and Intermit, I was invited by the youth group. They are the youth group talking to Sri Mulyani about climate change. And they are very militant. Of course, they are talking about all, maybe mostly normative. I don't want the forest to be destroyed. I want climate change to be, in this case, to be implemented, because we are going to be the one who suffer. But then when I talk to them, okay, I like your spirit and I'm going to use your spirit. Do you know the consequence of each of your policy requests in this case? Then I start telling about the cost of implementing climate change. And I said, this is the budget that we have that can afford this much. This is going to be like the HOLO, which is supposed to be this international trillion of money, which is not yet here. So this is one of the examples in which you can use modeling, of course, to frame the policy discussion, providing evidence and motivate them to go to the direction that we really want. I think that's going to be very, very important. Intermit mentioned earlier about you may be better to have a mini model which is simpler but complementing big, more complicated. I think I agree with that. Because sometimes, Axel, we in the political process, we will discuss a certain issue without talking about the bigger context. But they really want to have a clear, maybe like evidence to support their political decision. For example, like whether you are going to provide subsidy or reducing subsidy, whether the subsidy should be for the electricity or fuel or for the direct subsidy that you can target it. All these choices, you don't need like a big complex model. You just provide maybe a simple comparative advantage of each of these comparative equilibrium, partial equilibrium. You don't have to have like big general equilibrium with all complex building block, but they are powerful enough to say that if you do this, this is going to reduce poverty. This is going to also improve the welfare of your constituent. And that is something which is going to be very powerful. So for us as a policymaker, you really have to make sure, especially if you are a technocrat, you want to bridge between the political cycle, which is tend to be myopic and short term, with the concern on a long term. But you need to, in order for you to be able to build this kind of political commitment and support, the evidence coming from model, whether this is simpler or complex one, is going to help us to make the case. And if you are credible enough and you are lucky enough, and in politics you sometimes need that luck, Axel, then you are going to be able also to get the support. So that is my experience. So in a way, I guess many of this model we just now trying. Intermit mentioned about the carbon price for Indonesia, because we are not yet introducing this price in the carbon. They are not aware. But the reaction can be very different. The energy sector will be very saying, okay, who's going to pay that price? It is not the industry, it's going to be people. Is the people really want to pay like what, $3 per ton? Or in this case, you are going to go to the 500 as you just mentioned it in one of this model. It's going to be a big shock. Can we afford? Whether this is going to create a new poverty, unemployment, reduced growth, inflation, that kind of thing need to be presented, right? So even as simple as the carbon price, and I also believe that market power, market mechanism is actually can provide a very strong this commitment at the normative level into action, not only at the political or policy maker, but also private sector. But you have to be very mindful about the consequence of even introducing this kind of regulation or policy such as carbon price. So for Indonesia, we now build this market mechanism. We will implement step by step. We will familiarize this market first, building the credibility of this market, while also testing the regulation and see. We will start from the very specific energy sector first, or in this case, coal first. Then you are going to expand implementation of this market. I think that's going to be exactly what Intermit saying on this model, which gradual approach, but if it is credible enough, ambitious but gradual, I think it's going to get much more chance to get the political support.
Great. Well, thank you. I fear that we have to leave it here, but I think there are a couple of important takeaways. First of all, I think when you said, in particular with climate change, gradual but certain, you will need to have that. I think also the other part, what is interesting when you talked about carbon prices, and when countries are not familiar, that models actually could help also in the awareness building process. What are ultimately the impacts? So I think this is what listening to you, Sri Mulyani, is models will be useful when the questions are well posed. They need to be sharp. Because as you say, is you as a finance mayor are constantly confronted with incredible trade-off decisions. So if you come with a mushy model, you will have mushy answers and you have nothing from it. So I think that is what also the challenge for us is when we are thinking about the macro link and then ultimately the impact also on climate, we will need to work on that further and particularly see how we can sharpen this more. The final thing on the macro is clearly, and you have been alluding also to it, is that there are huge costs to this. So what the international community or the world thinks that should happen in Indonesia may not be the reality in Indonesia, because basically, as you say, the electricity sector in Indonesia is not that you go just and switch on and switch off. And today I will have renewable, and tomorrow I have something else. You will have years of challenge ahead of it, particularly on the coal exit, and it doesn't come cheaply. So therefore, I think these models will need to work on this. But I think this was very useful. Basically, how the bank is approaching this with a set of models trying to respond to some of the things, but also as the policymaker, you, Sri, to see how we can use this. I hope that people enjoyed the conversation. Let me have a huge thanks to Sri Mulyani for taking the time. She has been, I know you were flying around from Rome to Glasgow for the G20. Now, I guess the domestic agenda has been piling up. So the world is not easy on you. And thank you, Indermet. What I would suggest is if there are some useful references or a description of the models we use, we could put that on our website, or that people can easily follow this. I would just say, keep on, to those who are watching, keep on looking at the bank's website on COP26 as well. Climate Action World Bank Group, hashtag, to see what is happening. We'll put all this information there. And with this, good evening, Sri Mulyani, and have a great day in the event. Thank you for joining, and a good day to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you, Ibu.